Sarah Martinez had dreamed of this moment since she was 12 years old. Standing at the gates of Fort Harrison Military Training Center, her heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and terror. The massive iron gates seemed to stretch endlessly upward, and beyond them lay the place where she would either become the soldier she'd always wanted to be, or wash out like so many others before her. The bus ride from her small hometown in Texas had taken 14 hours. Sarah had spent most of that time staring out the window, watching the landscape change from familiar desert plains to thick forests and rolling hills. She'd barely slept, too nervous and excited to close her eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. Now as she grabbed her single duffel bag and stepped off the bus with 37 other recruits, the reality of what she was about to face hit her like a brick wall. Move it, move it, move it. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A drill sergeant appeared as if from thin air, his campaign hat pulled low over his eyes, his uniform so crisp it could cut glass. You maggots have exactly 30 seconds to form a line, shortest to tallest. Anyone who can't follow simple instructions doesn't belong here. Sarah quickly found her place in line, standing between a tall, lanky boy who looked like he'd never seen a gym and a stocky girl with arms like tree trunks. The drill sergeant paced back and forth in front of them, his boots making sharp clicking sounds on the concrete. Sarah tried to keep her eyes straight ahead, but she couldn't help noticing how some of the other recruits were already sweating, despite the cool morning air. "My name is Drill Sergeant Rodriguez," the man barked. "For the next 12 weeks I own you. You will eat when I tell you to eat, sleep when I tell you to sleep, and breathe when I tell you to breathe. Some of you think you're tough. Some of you think you know what hard work means. You're all wrong." He stopped directly in front of Sarah, so close she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You, recruit. What's your name?" "Sarah Martinez, Drill Sergeant," she replied, proud that her voice came out strong and clear. "And why are you here, Martinez?" Sarah had practiced this answer 100 times. "To serve my country and become the best soldier I can be, Drill Sergeant." Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Something flickered in his expression, but it was gone so quickly Sarah thought she might have imagined it. "We'll see about that, Martinez. We'll see about that." The next several hours passed in a blur of paperwork, medical checks, and equipment issue. Sarah was assigned to a barracks with 7 other female recruits, each given a narrow metal bunk and a small locker for their personal belongings. The other girls seemed nice enough. There was Amy from California who'd joined to pay for college, Rebecca from New York who came from a long line of military family, and Janet from Florida who'd been working dead-end jobs since high school. As they unpacked their few belongings, the girls chatted nervously about what they expected from boot camp. Sarah listened but didn't contribute much to the conversation. She'd always been more of a listener than a talker, preferring to observe and learn before jumping into social situations. Besides, she had something on her mind that she couldn't shake, the way Drill Sergeant Rodriguez had looked at her during their first meeting. "Hey, Sarah," Amy called from across the room. "You okay? You've been quiet since we got here." Sarah smiled and nodded. "Just taking it all in, I guess. This place is bigger than I expected." It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that Sarah had a secret, something she'd been hiding her entire life. Something that could potentially change everything if the wrong person found out about it. She'd hoped that coming to boot camp would be a fresh start, a chance to prove herself based on her abilities rather than her past. But now, looking around at the sterile barracks and thinking about all the medical exams and uniform fittings she'd have to endure, she wondered if keeping her secret would be possible. That evening, after a dinner of mystery meat and overcooked vegetables, the recruits were given their first real taste of military life. They were marched to a large auditorium where Commander James Patterson addressed the new arrivals. He was an older man, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and kind eyes that somehow managed to look stern at the same time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commander Patterson began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room without the need for a microphone, "you are here because you've made a choice. A choice to serve something greater than yourselves. Over the next 12 weeks, you will be pushed beyond what you think are your limits. Some of you will discover strength you never knew you had. Others will discover that this life isn't for them, and that's okay too." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What I want you to remember is that being a soldier isn't just about physical strength or following orders. It's about integrity, honor, and taking care of the person next to you. The uniform you'll wear represents something sacred, the willingness to put your life on the line for people you've never met, in places you've never been, for ideals that are bigger than any one person. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as he spoke. She'd heard similar words before, but hearing them here in this place made them feel more real somehow. She looked around at the other recruits, seeing the mixture of determination and fear on their faces, and realized that everyone here was carrying something: dreams, fears, secrets, hopes for the future. Tomorrow, Commander Patterson continued, your real training begins. You'll be issued your uniforms, complete your final medical evaluations, and begin the process of becoming soldiers. Get some rest tonight. It's the last easy night you'll have for a while. As the recruits filed out of the auditorium, Sarah caught sight of Commander Patterson watching them leave. For just a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. Like with Drill Sergeant Rodriguez earlier, she thought she saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or confusion. But before she could think about it too much, the crowd swept her along toward the barracks. That night, as she lay in her narrow bunk listening to the nervous whispers and occasional snores of her bunkmates, Sarah touched the spot on her left shoulder, where her secret lay hidden beneath her civilian clothes. Tomorrow, when they issued uniforms and conducted medical exams, someone might see it. And if they did, her new life might be over before it even began. Sarah Martinez had dreamed of this moment since she was 12 years old. Standing at the gates of Fort Harrison Military Training Center, her heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and terror. The massive iron gates seemed to stretch endlessly upward, and beyond them lay the place where she would either become the soldier she'd always wanted to be, or wash out like so many others before her. The bus ride from her small hometown in Texas had taken 14 hours. Sarah had spent most of that time staring out the window, watching the landscape change from familiar desert plains to thick forests and rolling hills. She'd barely slept, too nervous and excited to close her eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. Now as she grabbed her single duffel bag and stepped off the bus with 37 other recruits, the reality of what she was about to face hit her like a brick wall. Move it, move it, move it. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A drill sergeant appeared as if from thin air, his campaign hat pulled low over his eyes, his uniform so crisp it could cut glass. You maggots have exactly 30 seconds to form a line, shortest to tallest. Anyone who can't follow simple instructions doesn't belong here. Sarah quickly found her place in line, standing between a tall, lanky boy who looked like he'd never seen a gym and a stocky girl with arms like tree trunks. The drill sergeant paced back and forth in front of them, his boots making sharp clicking sounds on the concrete. Sarah tried to keep her eyes straight ahead, but she couldn't help noticing how some of the other recruits were already sweating, despite the cool morning air. My name is Drill Sergeant Rodriguez, the man barked. For the next 12 weeks, I own you. You will eat when I tell you to eat, sleep when I tell you to sleep, and breathe when I tell you to breathe. Some of you think you're tough. Some of you think you know what hard work means. You're all wrong. He stopped directly in front of Sarah, so close she could smell the coffee on his breath. You, recruit. What's your name? Sarah Martinez, drill sergeant, she replied, proud that her voice came out strong and clear. And why are you here, Martinez? Sarah had practiced this answer 100 times. To serve my country and become the best soldier I can be, drill sergeant. Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. Something flickered in his expression, but it was gone so quickly Sarah thought she might have imagined it. We'll see about that, Martinez. We'll see about that. The next several hours passed in a blur of paperwork, medical checks, and equipment issue. Sarah was assigned to a barracks with 7 other female recruits, each given a narrow metal bunk and a small locker for their personal belongings. The other girls seemed nice enough. There was Amy from California who'd joined to pay for college, Rebecca from New York who came from a long line of military family, and Janet from Florida who'd been working dead-end jobs since high school. As they unpacked their few belongings, the girls chatted nervously about what they expected from boot camp. Sarah listened but didn't contribute much to the conversation. She'd always been more of a listener than a talker, preferring to observe and learn before jumping into social situations. Besides, she had something on her mind that she couldn't shake, the way Drill Sergeant Rodriguez had looked at her during their first meeting. Hey, Sarah, Amy called from across the room. You okay? You've been quiet since we got here. Sarah smiled and nodded. Just taking it all in, I guess. This place is bigger than I expected. It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that Sarah had a secret, something she'd been hiding her entire life. something that could potentially change everything if the wrong person found out about it. She'd hoped that coming to boot camp would be a fresh start, a chance to prove herself based on her abilities rather than her past. But now, looking around at the sterile barracks and thinking about all the medical exams and uniform fittings she'd have to endure, she wondered if keeping her secret would be possible. That evening, after a dinner of mystery meat and overcooked vegetables, the recruits were given their first real taste of military life. They were marched to a large auditorium where Commander James Patterson addressed the new arrivals. He was an older man, probably in his 50s, with gray hair and kind eyes that somehow managed to look stern at the same time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Commander Patterson began, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room without the need for a microphone, "you are here because you've made a choice. A choice to serve something greater than yourselves. Over the next 12 weeks, you will be pushed beyond what you think are your limits. Some of you will discover strength you never knew you had. Others will discover that this life isn't for them, and that's okay too." He paused, letting his words sink in. "What I want you to remember is that being a soldier isn't just about physical strength or following orders. It's about integrity, honor, and taking care of the person next to you. The uniform you'll wear represents something sacred, the willingness to put your life on the line for people you've never met, in places you've never been, for ideals that are bigger than any one person." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as he spoke. She'd heard similar words before, but hearing them here in this place made them feel more real somehow. She looked around at the other recruits, seeing the mixture of determination and fear on their faces, and realized that everyone here was carrying something: dreams, fears, secrets, hopes for the future. "Tomorrow," Commander Patterson continued, "your real training begins. You'll be issued your uniforms, complete your final medical evaluations, and begin the process of becoming soldiers. Get some rest tonight. It's the last easy night you'll have for a while." As the recruits filed out of the auditorium, Sarah caught sight of Commander Patterson watching them leave. For just a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. Like with Drill Sergeant Rodriguez earlier, she thought she saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or confusion. But before she could think about it too much, the crowd swept her along toward the barracks. That night, as she lay in her narrow bunk listening to the nervous whispers and occasional snores of her bunkmates, Sarah touched the spot on her left shoulder, where her secret lay hidden beneath her civilian clothes. Tomorrow, when they issued uniforms and conducted medical exams, someone might see it. And if they did, her new life might be over before it even began. Sarah woke before the alarm the next morning, her stomach churning with anxiety. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts about Commander Patterson's reaction to her birthmark. Every time she'd started to drift off, she'd remembered the look in his eyes, the way he'd stared at her like he'd seen a ghost. The day started like the previous one, with PT, breakfast, and then a march to the training fields. But something was different. Sarah could feel it in the way some of the drill instructors looked at her, in the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by. Word had spread about something, though she couldn't be sure what. During morning training exercises, Sarah threw herself into the activities with unusual intensity, trying to prove that whatever was happening behind the scenes, she belonged here. They practiced basic military movements, learned to march in formation, and began weapons familiarization. Sarah excelled at everything, her natural athleticism and determination helping her stand out among the recruits. But even as she performed well, she noticed that Drill Sergeant Rodriguez was watching her more closely than the others. Several times she caught him speaking quietly into his radio, his eyes never leaving her. During a water break, she overheard him talking to another instructor. Unusual situation. Commander wants to see her after lunch. Never seen anything like it in 20 years. The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She was starting to realize that whatever was happening was bigger than just a commander noticing an unusual birthmark. This was something that was shaking up people who had seen everything the military had to offer. Lunch was a torturous affair. Sarah tried to eat, but the food tasted like cardboard in her mouth. Amy, sitting next to her, noticed her distress. "Hey, you okay?" Amy asked quietly. "You look like you're about to throw up." "I'm fine," Sarah lied. "Just nervous about this afternoon's training." Amy studied her for a moment. "Is it true that Commander Patterson called you out yesterday during uniform fitting?" Rebecca heard some of the drill instructors talking about it. Before Sarah could answer, Drill Sergeant Rodriguez appeared beside their table. Martinez, finish your lunch and report to Commander Patterson's office. Now. The walk to the administration building felt like the longest walk of Sarah's life. Her boots seemed to echo too loudly on the concrete path, and every person she passed seemed to be staring at her. The building itself was an imposing brick structure with tall windows and a heavy wooden door that looked like it belonged on a fortress. Commander Patterson's office was on the second floor, down a hallway lined with portraits of distinguished military officers from decades past. Their painted eyes seemed to follow Sarah as she walked, judging her, wondering what a foster kid from Texas was doing in their sacred halls. She knocked on the commander's door, her knuckles barely making a sound on the heavy wood. "Enter," came the voice from inside. Commander Patterson's office was larger than Sarah had expected, with a massive desk, bookcases filled with military manuals and history books, and walls covered with commendations, photographs, and unit flags. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately was that the commander wasn't alone. There was another man in the room, an older gentleman in civilian clothes who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Recruit Martinez," Commander Patterson said, gesturing to a chair in front of his desk. "Please have a seat." Sarah sat down, trying to keep her back straight and her hands steady on her knees. Commander Patterson looked even more shaken than he had the day before, his face pale and his eyes red-rimmed as if he'd been up all night. "Martinez," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "I want to introduce you to Dr. Richard Hawkins. He's a geneticist who specializes in hereditary markings and birthmarks. I asked him to come here after our conversation yesterday." Dr. Hawkins leaned forward in his chair, studying Sarah with intense scientific curiosity. "Miss Martinez, I understand you have a very unusual birthmark. Would you mind if I examined it?" Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure both men could hear it.
"Sir, may I ask why?"
"I don't understand what's happening here." Commander Patterson and Dr. Hawkins exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Finally, the commander spoke. "Martinez, 23 years ago, I served in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division. I was a young lieutenant then, part of a special operations unit that was involved in some very classified missions. During one of those missions, we rescued several civilians from a hostile area, including a pregnant woman who was about to give birth." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Commander Patterson continued, his voice growing quieter with each word. "The woman gave birth to a baby girl during the evacuation, but there were complications. The mother died from her injuries before we could get her to a medical facility. The baby survived, but we were in the middle of a war zone with no way to properly care for an infant. We had to make a decision." Dr. Hawkins picked up the story. "The baby was brought to a military hospital, and then eventually transferred to civilian authorities in the United States for adoption. But before that happened, the medical staff documented something remarkable. The child had been born with a birthmark that was virtually identical to the 82nd Airborne Division insignia." Sarah's world seemed to tilt on its axis. "You're saying, you think I'm that baby?" "We're not sure," Commander Patterson replied. "But the coincidence is extraordinary. A baby with that exact birthmark, found in the same region where our unit was operating, transferred to San Antonio around the same time you would have been placed for adoption." Dr. Hawkins opened a briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "I've brought copies of the medical records from that time. With your permission, I'd like to compare the documentation of that birthmark with yours. If they match, then we'll know who your father was," Commander Patterson finished quietly. Sarah's head was spinning. "My father? You knew my father?" Commander Patterson's hands were shaking as he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a framed photograph. He turned it around so Sarah could see it. The photo showed a group of soldiers in combat gear, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera despite the harsh desert environment around them. "The mission where we rescued your mother," Commander Patterson said, pointing to one of the soldiers in the photo. "It was led by this man, Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez." Sarah stared at the photograph, her breath catching in her throat. The soldier Commander Patterson was pointing to looked remarkably like her. The same dark hair, the same strong jawline, the same determined eyes. "Michael Rodriguez was one of the finest soldiers I ever served with," Commander Patterson continued. "He was brave, honorable, and completely dedicated to protecting innocent people. He was also—" The commander's voice broke slightly. "He was killed in action 2 weeks after we rescued your mother. An IED explosion during a routine patrol. Dr. Hawkins cleared his throat gently. Miss Martinez, I need to ask you to remove your shirt so I can photograph and document your birthmark. If it matches the medical records from 23 years ago, we'll have our answer. Sarah's hands trembled as she stood up and began to unbutton her uniform shirt. This was the moment she'd been dreading, but now it meant something completely different. This wasn't about hiding a strange birthmark anymore. This was about discovering who she really was. As she slipped off her shirt and turned to show her left shoulder, she heard Dr. Hawkins' intake of breath sharply. Commander Patterson stood up from behind his desk, his face going completely white as he stared at the birthmark. Dear God, he whispered. It's identical. Exactly identical. Dr. Hawkins was already taking photographs with a digital camera, comparing them to images in his folder. The size, shape, positioning, everything matches perfectly. This is definitely the same birthmark documented in the medical records. Sarah turned back to face Commander Patterson, and what she saw in his eyes made her step backward in shock. The tough military commander was crying, tears streaming down his face as he stared at her. You're Michael's daughter, he said, his voice breaking completely. You're Maria Elena Rodriguez. We named you after your mother. The room seemed to spin around Sarah as the full weight of the revelation hit her. She had a name. She had a father. She had a story that went back to a war zone on the other side of the world, to a man who had died protecting people he'd never met. I don't understand, she managed to say, her own voice shaking. If you knew about me, if you knew about the birthmark, why didn't anyone come looking for me? Commander Patterson wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Because we thought you had died, Maria. The last report we received said that the baby had succumbed to complications at the hospital. We held a memorial service for you and your mother. I've been carrying the guilt of not being able to save you both for 23 years. As Sarah stood there in Commander Patterson's office, half-dressed and completely overwhelmed, she realized that everything she thought she knew about herself had just changed forever. But more than that, she realized that the uniform she'd put on for the first time yesterday wasn't just clothing. It was her birthright, inherited from a father she'd never known but who had died serving the same ideals she'd felt drawn to her entire life. Sarah sat in the small medical office adjacent to Commander Patterson's quarters, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as Dr. Hawkins finished documenting her birthmark. The revelation that she was Maria Elena Rodriguez, daughter of a fallen soldier, had left her feeling like she was floating outside her own body, watching someone else's life unfold. The genetic markers are conclusive, Dr. Hawkins was saying to Commander Patterson, though his words seemed to be coming from very far away. Combined with the birthmark documentation and the timeline, there's no doubt. This is Michael Rodriguez's daughter. Commander Patterson sat heavily in a chair across from Sarah, his face still pale from the shock of discovery. Maria, he said softly, testing out the name. Your father used to talk about what he'd name his children someday. He said if he had a daughter, he'd name her Maria after his grandmother, and Elena after the woman who raised him in the orphanage where he grew up. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that both she and her father had grown up without their birth families. Tell me about him, she said quietly. Tell me about my father. Commander Patterson's expression softened as he remembered. Michael was the kind of soldier who made everyone around him better. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he had this way of keeping people calm under pressure. When things got bad, and they got bad a lot over there, Michael was the one who reminded us why we were fighting. He pulled out another photograph from his desk, this one showing a single soldier kneeling next to a group of Afghan children, handing out candy bars and smiling. He carried extra rations in his pack, not for himself, but for any kids we might encounter. He said that every child deserved to feel safe even in the middle of a war. Sarah studied the photograph, memorizing every detail of her father's face. She could see herself in his features, but more than that, she could see something in his expression that felt familiar, a determination to protect others, a sense of duty that seemed to come from deep inside. The mission where we found your mother, Commander Patterson continued, it wasn't supposed to happen. We were on patrol when we got reports of civilians trapped in a building that was taking heavy fire. Command told us to leave it, said it was too dangerous and not part of our objectives. But Michael, he shook his head with a mixture of pride and sadness. Michael said we didn't leave people behind, orders or no orders. Dr. Hawkins had finished his documentation and was quietly packing his equipment, giving them space to talk. Sarah noticed that he kept glancing at her with a mixture of scientific fascination and human sympathy. So he disobeyed orders? Sarah asked. We all did, Commander Patterson replied. Michael convinced us that some things were more important than following rules. He had a way of making you believe that doing the right thing was always worth the risk. So we went in. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the training fields where new recruits were learning to be soldiers. The building was an old school that had been turned into a refugee shelter. There were about 30 people inside, mostly women, children, and elderly men. Your mother was among them, and she was in labor. Sarah tried to imagine the scene. Her father, barely older than she was now, making split-second decisions that would save lives and ultimately cost him his own. The evacuation took 6 hours. Commander Patterson continued. We had to move everyone under cover, dodging sniper fire and mortar rounds. Your mother gave birth in the back of our transport vehicle, while Michael held her hand and told her everything was going to be okay. He was the first person to hold you after you were born. The image hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her father had been there for her birth, had held her in his arms, had helped bring her safely into the world. And then just 2 weeks later, he was gone. What happened to him? She asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. Commander Patterson's shoulders sagged. 2 weeks after we got you and your mother to safety, Michael's unit was on a routine patrol in a different sector. They were checking on a village that had reported suspicious activity. The entire patrol walked into an ambush, IEDs followed by small arms fire. Michael was killed instantly when the first bomb went off. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, though she wasn't sure if she was crying for the father she'd never known or for the young soldier who died trying to help others. I was the one who had to write the letter to his next of kin, Commander Patterson said quietly. But Michael didn't have any family that we could locate. No parents, no siblings, no girlfriend back home. The only family he had was us, his unit. And according to the last report we received, you had died in the hospital, so there was no one left to tell his story to. Dr. Hawkins cleared his throat gently. If I may, he said, there's something else you should know. I've been researching military families with hereditary markings for several years, and your case is unique. Birthmarks like yours, shaped like military insignia, are extraordinarily rare, but in the few documented cases, they seem to appear in families with strong military traditions going back generations. Sarah looked up at him through her tears. Are you saying this isn't just a coincidence? I'm saying that your father's family may have a longer military history than Commander Patterson realizes. The genetic markers that create these kinds of birthmarks are often linked to generations of military service. It's possible that your calling to serve wasn't just inspired by your father. It may be literally written in your DNA. Commander Patterson turned back from the window. There's something else, Maria. Something I need to tell you about why this is so important. Beyond just the personal connection. Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at him expectantly. Your father didn't just save your mother and the other civilians that day, he continued. The intelligence we gathered during that mission, information your mother had about enemy positions and planned attacks, it saved hundreds of American and Allied lives. Your father's decision to disobey orders and rescue those people changed the course of several major operations. He pulled out a medal case from his desk drawer. Michael was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. But more than that, he was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork got lost in bureaucracy, and with no family to claim it, the recommendation was forgotten. Sarah stared at the medal case, her mind reeling. Her father had been a hero, and she'd grown up never knowing his name. There's one more thing, Commander Patterson said, his voice becoming formal. As of today, you're being transferred out of basic training. Sarah's heart stopped. What, why? Sir, please, I want to finish. I want to earn my place here. Commander Patterson held up his hand. You're being transferred to officer candidate school. Michael Rodriguez's daughter isn't going to start at the bottom. You're going to be trained as an officer, just like your father should have been if he'd lived long enough. The words hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. Officer training meant years of advanced education, specialized training, and eventually leading other soldiers. It was everything she'd dreamed of but never thought possible for a foster kid from Texas. But sir, she protested, I haven't earned it. I've only been here 2 days. Commander Patterson smiled for the first time since the conversation began. Maria, You earned it 23 years ago when your father gave his life to save others. And you've been earning it every day since then, carrying his strength and his calling without even knowing where they came from. As Sarah sat there, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd learned, she realized that her life had just divided into two parts, before she knew who she was and after. The scared foster kid who'd arrived at boot camp 2 days ago was gone forever, replaced by Maria Elena Rodriguez, daughter of a war hero, inheritor of a legacy of service that stretched back generations. But with that inheritance came responsibility. She wasn't just representing herself anymore. She was carrying forward her father's memory and the sacrifice he'd made for people he'd never met. The uniform that had been taken away during the medical examination wasn't just clothing anymore. It was armor, carrying the weight of history and the promise of a future that her father had died protecting. The officer candidate school at Fort Harrison was a different world from basic training. Where the enlisted barracks had been crowded and noisy, the OCS quarters were more like college dormitories, with private rooms and study areas designed for future leaders, rather than soldiers learning to follow orders. But for Sarah, Maria, she was still getting used to her real name. The change felt overwhelming rather than exciting. It had been a week since the revelation about her father, and she was struggling to process everything, while simultaneously trying to keep up with an accelerated curriculum designed to turn college graduates into military officers. The other candidates in her class were older, most of them with 4-year degrees and some with advanced education. At 19, having barely graduated high school, Sarah felt like she was drowning in coursework that assumed knowledge she'd never had the opportunity to acquire. Rodriguez called Captain Sarah Chen, the tactical instructor, as the candidates filed out of their morning strategy session. "A word, please." Sarah's stomach dropped. She'd been waiting for this moment. The moment when someone would realize that she didn't belong here. That promoting a basic training recruit directly to OCS had been a mistake. Captain Chen was a small woman with sharp eyes and an economy of movement that suggested she could handle herself in any situation. She'd served 3 tours overseas and had a reputation for being fair but demanding with her candidates. "Walk with me," Captain Chen said, leading Sarah away from the other candidates and toward a quiet courtyard area between buildings. "How are you adjusting to the program?" "Fine, ma'am," Sarah replied automatically, though it was far from the truth. Captain Chen stopped walking and turned to face her. "Rodriguez, I've been doing this for 8 years. I can spot a candidate who's struggling from across a parade ground. You're behind in your academic work, you're not participating in class discussions, and you look like you haven't slept in a week. That's not fine." Sarah felt her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "Ma'am, It's a lot to take in. The coursework is more advanced than anything I've done before." "I'm sure it is," Captain Chen said, her voice gentler now. "I've read your file, Rodriguez. I know about your background, and I know about how you ended up here. What I want to know is whether you're struggling because the work is hard, or because you don't think you deserve to be here." The question cut straight to the heart of what Sarah had been wrestling with all week. "Both, I think," she admitted quietly. Captain Chen nodded. "Can I tell you something? Every candidate who comes through this program struggles with imposter syndrome to some degree. The college graduates worry they don't have enough real-world experience. The prior enlisted worry they don't have enough education. The ones with military families worry they'll never live up to their legacy. And the ones without military families worry they don't belong at all." She gestured to a bench and they both sat down. "But here's what I've learned. The best officers aren't the ones who never struggle. They're the ones who struggle and find a way to push through anyway. Your father understood that." Sarah looked at her in surprise. "You knew my father?" "I never served with him directly, but his reputation preceded him in certain circles. The story of that rescue mission, and what he sacrificed to make it happen, it became something of a legend among junior officers. We used it as a case study in ethical leadership. The idea that her father's actions had been taught to other soldiers was both inspiring and intimidating." "What if I can't live up to that?" Sarah asked. "What if you're not supposed to?" Captain Chen replied. "Maria, you're not here to be your father. You're here to be the officer you're meant to be. Your father's legacy isn't a burden you have to carry. It's a foundation you can build on." That afternoon, Sarah threw herself into her studies with renewed determination. She spent hours in the library, working through tactical scenarios and military history, slowly building the knowledge base she needed to keep up with her classmates. Some of the other candidates, initially skeptical of someone who'd been fast-tracked through the program, began to warm up to her when they saw how hard she was working. "Hey, Rodriguez," called Thomas Chen, no relation to Captain Chen, despite sharing a surname, as she packed up her books after a particularly grueling strategy session. "A few of us are forming a study group for the leadership ethics exam. Want to join?" Sarah looked around at the group, 5 candidates who'd been top of their class since day 1. A month ago, she would have been too intimidated to accept. "Sure," she said. "I could use the help." The study group met 3 times a week in Thomas's room, working through complex scenarios that tested not just their knowledge of military regulations, but their ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. Sarah found that while she might lack some of the academic background of her peers, her life experiences had given her a different kind of wisdom. During one session, they were discussing a scenario where a commanding officer had to choose between following orders that might result in civilian casualties or disobeying commands to protect innocent lives. "The answer is obvious," said Jennifer Walsh, a West Point graduate who consistently scored highest in their class. "You follow orders. Military discipline depends on the chain of command being respected. But what about the moral obligation to protect non-combatants?" argued Marcus Williams, whose father had been a career Navy officer. "Sometimes following orders blindly leads to atrocities." The group debated back and forth, citing regulations and historical precedents. Finally, Thomas turned to Sarah, who'd been listening quietly. "What do you think, Maria? You've been pretty quiet." Sarah thought about her father, about the choice he'd made to disobey orders to save civilians, about the cost of that choice and the lives it had saved. "I think," she said slowly, "that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the ones where there's no clear right answer. My father once told his commanding officer that some things were more important than following rules. That decision cost him his life, but it saved 30 people and changed the course of several military operations." The room fell silent. Sarah realized she'd never told any of them the full story about how she'd ended up in OCS. "Your father was military?" Jennifer asked. "Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, 82nd Airborne," Sarah replied, and she felt a surge of pride saying it. "He was killed in action in Afghanistan 23 years ago." Over the next hour, Sarah found herself telling them the story, about the birthmark, about the rescue mission, about growing up in foster care never knowing her real identity. When she finished, Thomas shook his head in amazement. "That's incredible," he said. "And that birthmark is really identical to the 82nd Airborne insignia?" Sarah nodded and pulled up her sleeve to show them. The reaction was immediate. Gasps of surprise and amazement from the group. "That's not just unusual," Marcus said, studying the mark closely. That's like being born with your destiny written on your skin." Jennifer, who'd been skeptical of Sarah's fast-track admission to OCS, looked at her with new respect. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I thought you were here because of some kind of affirmative action program. I didn't realize you were here because you inherited your place." As the weeks passed, Sarah began to find her rhythm in the program. Her grades improved, her confidence grew, and she started to see herself not as an imposter but as someone who belonged. The other candidates accepted her as an equal, and the instructors began to see flashes of the same leadership potential that had made her father legendary. But the real test came during a field exercise designed to simulate the kind of complex decision-making scenarios they'd face as officers. Sarah's team was tasked with evacuating civilians from a hostile area while under simulated enemy fire. As they approached the target building, their communications went down, and they had to decide whether to proceed without backup or abort the mission. Standing outside that building, with smoke machines creating artificial chaos and instructors playing enemy combatants, Sarah felt something click into place. This wasn't just an exercise. This was the moment she'd been preparing for her entire life, even when she didn't know it. "We're going in," she told her team, her voice calm and confident. "Rodriguez, Williams, you're with me. Walsh, Chen, set up a perimeter and watch for simulated threats. We don't leave anyone behind." As they moved through the building, successfully evacuating the mock civilians while maintaining tactical awareness, Sarah realized that she wasn't just following her father's example. She was creating her own. The birthmark on her shoulder wasn't just a symbol of inherited duty. It was a reminder that some things transcended bloodlines and birth circumstances. Some things were written in the heart, passed down through courage and sacrifice, and earned through the willingness to put others before yourself. When the exercise ended and their instructors debriefed the scenarios, Captain Chen pulled Sarah aside. "Outstanding work today, Rodriguez," she said. "That was exactly the kind of decision-making we want to see from future officers. Your father would be proud." Graduation from officer candidate school was only 2 weeks away when Sarah received the news that would change everything once again. She was in the library, reviewing her final leadership project, when Captain Chen approached her table with an expression that was difficult to read. "Rodriguez, I need you to come with me," Captain Chen said quietly. "There's someone here to see you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Over the past 4 months, she'd grown accustomed to unexpected visits and revelations about her past. She followed Captain Chen out of the library and across the campus to the administration building, wondering what new piece of her life's puzzle was about to be revealed. In the conference room, she found Commander Patterson waiting with 2 people she didn't recognize, an elderly Hispanic woman with kind eyes and calloused hands, and a man in his 40s wearing a military dress uniform with more decorations than Sarah had ever seen on one person. "Maria," Commander Patterson said, standing as she entered, "I'd like you to meet some very special people. This is Colonel James Morrison, and this is Mrs. Elena Vasquez." The woman stepped forward, tears already streaming down her face as she studied Sarah's features. "Dios mío," she whispered in Spanish. "You look just like him, just like my Miguel." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. "Miguel? Michael?" Commander Patterson explained gently. "Mrs. Vasquez knew your father by his real name, Miguel Rodriguez. She was his foster mother for 6 years when he was a child." Mrs. Vasquez reached out and touched Sarah's face with trembling hands. "Mijo was so proud when he joined the army. He came to see me before he deployed, told me he was going to make a difference in the world. He said if anything happened to him, I should know that he died protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." Sarah felt tears burning her eyes. "You raised him?" "From age 8 to 14, Mrs. Vasquez nodded. "He was so angry when he first came to me, so hurt by everything he'd lost. But underneath all that anger was the biggest heart I'd ever seen. He used to bring home stray animals, injured birds, anything that needed help. I used to tell him he couldn't save every creature in the world, and he would say, 'Maybe not, but I can try.'" Colonel Morrison stepped forward. "Miss Rodriguez, I'm here on behalf of the Pentagon. We've been reviewing your father's service record and the circumstances surrounding the mission, where you were born. There are some things that need to be corrected." He opened a briefcase and pulled out several official-looking documents. "Your father's Medal of Honor recommendation wasn't lost in bureaucracy as previously believed. It was deliberately suppressed by an officer who was later court-martialed for corruption. The recommendation has been reviewed and approved by the current Secretary of Defense." Sarah's legs felt weak. "What does that mean?" "It means," Colonel Morrison continued, "that your father is being posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor in combat. The ceremony will be held next month at the Pentagon, and as his next of kin, you would be the one to receive it." The room spun around Sarah as the magnitude of what she was hearing sank in. The Medal of Honor was something she'd only read about in history books, the ultimate recognition of sacrifice and heroism. "But there's more," Commander Patterson added. "Colonel Morrison is also here to discuss your assignment after graduation." Colonel Morrison nodded. "Miss Rodriguez, your performance in OCS has been exceptional. Combined with your father's legacy and the unique circumstances of your case, you're being offered something extraordinary. The 82nd Airborne Division, your father's unit, has requested you for assignment as a second lieutenant upon graduation." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "The 82nd Airborne? But I haven't even graduated yet. I haven't proven myself in the field." "You've proven yourself in ways that matter more than field experience," Colonel Morrison replied. "Leadership isn't just about tactics and strategy. It's about inspiring others to be better than they thought they could be. Your instructors tell me you've done that consistently throughout your time here." Mrs. Vasquez squeezed Sarah's hand. "Miguel would be so proud of you, mija. He always said that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being afraid and doing the right thing anyway." Over the next hour, Sarah learned more about her father's childhood and the woman who had shaped him into the man who would one day save her life. Mrs. Vasquez told stories about Miguel's determination to excel in school despite changing foster homes, his devotion to helping younger kids who were struggling, and his dream of joining the military to serve something greater than himself. He used to say he wanted to make sure no child ever felt as alone as he had, Mrs. Vasquez explained. When he told me about the rescue mission in his last letter, he said he kept thinking about how scared those children must be, and how someone needed to show them that there were still people in the world who would risk everything to keep them safe. As the meeting concluded, Colonel Morrison handed Sarah a packet of information about her upcoming assignment. You'll be reporting to Fort Bragg after a brief leave following graduation. You'll be assigned to the same battalion. Your father served with. Many of the senior NCOs remember him and specifically requested to have his daughter under their command. The idea of serving alongside people who had known her father was both thrilling and terrifying. Would they expect her to be exactly like him? Would they judge her against a standard she could never meet? That evening, Sarah called Amy, her former bunkmate from basic training who had become one of her closest friends. Amy was now stationed in Germany working as a communications specialist. Maria, Amy's voice crackled through the international connection. How's OCS treating you? Are you ready for graduation? Amy, Sarah said, you're not going to believe what happened today. She told Amy about Mrs. Vasquez, about the Medal of Honor, about the assignment to the 82nd Airborne. When she finished, there was silence on the line for a long moment. Holy shit, Maria, Amy finally said. I mean, holy shit. Your dad is getting the Medal of Honor, and you're going to the 82nd Airborne? That's like military royalty. That's what scares me, Sarah admitted. What if I can't live up to it? What if I'm not the soldier my father was? Maria, listen to me, Amy said firmly. I've known you for 4 months now, and I've seen you grow from that scared kid who got off the bus at Fort Harrison into someone who could lead soldiers into combat. You're not supposed to be your father. You're supposed to be Maria Rodriguez, and that's more than enough. As Sarah hung up the phone, she walked to her window and looked out at the training fields where new candidates were learning the same lessons she'd mastered over the past months. Tomorrow she would begin her final week of training before graduation. In 2 weeks she would pin on the gold bars of a second lieutenant. And in a month she would stand in the Pentagon as her father received the nation's highest honor for valor. But tonight, she simply stood at her window and thought about a young soldier she'd never met, who had died protecting people he didn't know, and whose courage had somehow been passed down to her through blood and birthmark and the mysterious ways that heroism travels from one generation to the next. She touched the mark on her shoulder, no longer hidden beneath long sleeves but worn proudly as a reminder of where she came from and where she was going. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her leadership and her resolve. But tonight she was simply Maria Elena Rodriguez, daughter of a hero preparing to write the next chapter of a story that had begun in a war zone 23 years ago and would continue, wherever courage and compassion were needed. Most the uniform hanging in her closet, soon to bear the insignia of the 82nd Airborne Division, represented more than just her career. It represented the completion of a circle that had started when her father first picked her up as a newborn baby and whispered that everything was going to be okay. Now it was her turn to make sure that promise remained true for the next generation of people who needed protecting. The Pentagon's Medal of Honor ceremony room was smaller than Sarah had imagined, but somehow that made it feel more sacred rather than less impressive. Rows of chairs faced a simple podium where the Secretary of Defense would present her father's medal, and the walls were lined with portraits of previous recipients dating back to the Civil War. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing her dress blue uniform with the newly minted gold bars of a second lieutenant gleaming on her shoulders. Mrs. Vasquez sat beside her, clutching a worn photograph of young Miguel Rodriguez in his first Army uniform. Commander Patterson was there, along with Captain Chen and several of Sarah's former classmates from OCS, but what meant the most to Sarah were the dozen grizzled veterans scattered throughout the room, men who had served with her father and had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary of Defense began, we gather today to honor the extraordinary courage of Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, whose actions 23 years ago embodied the highest ideals of military service. Though this recognition comes far too late, The valor that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez displayed in Afghanistan serves as a reminder that heroism often comes from the simplest and most profound choice to put the lives of others before your own. As the secretary, read the citation detailing her father's actions during the rescue mission. Sarah found herself transported back to that day she'd never experienced, but had heard described so many times. She could almost see her young father, barely older than she was now, making the split-second decision to disobey orders and save 30 innocent lives for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The secretary continued. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Sarah stood as her name was called, walking to the podium on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The medal itself was smaller and simpler than she'd expected. A 5-pointed star hanging from a light blue ribbon dotted with 13 white stars. But as the secretary placed it in her hands, she felt the weight of history and sacrifice that it represented. Miss Rodriguez, the secretary said quietly, your father's courage saved not only the 30 civilians in that building, but countless other lives through the intelligence that was gathered that day. His legacy lives on in you and in every soldier who has heard his story and been inspired to choose service over safety. After the ceremony, the veterans who had served with her father gathered around Sarah, sharing stories and memories that brought Miguel Rodriguez to life in ways that official reports never could. Your old man had this laugh, said Sergeant First Class Danny Martinez, a stocky man with graying temples who had been Miguel's squad leader. Even in the worst situations, he could find something to laugh about. Used to drive the enemy crazy because they'd hear our guys laughing in the middle of a firefight and think we were all insane. Master Sergeant Robert Thompson, now retired but still carrying himself like the paratrooper he'd once been, pulled out a small notebook. Miguel kept a journal, he said, handing it to Sarah. Command released it to me after he died, but I never knew what to do with it. Seems like it belongs with you now. Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands, seeing her father's handwriting for the first time. The entries were short and practical, mostly noting daily activities and mission details. But scattered throughout were longer passages that revealed the man behind the soldier. One entry, dated just days before the rescue mission, read, Got a letter from Mrs. V today. She says the neighborhood kids have been asking about me, wanting to know when I'm coming home to help with their homework. Makes me think about what kind of father I'd be someday. Would I be patient enough? Strong enough? Would I know how to show a kid that the world is worth fighting for, even when it seems broken? I guess all you can do is try to be the person you'd want your children to grow up to be. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she read her father's words. He had been thinking about being a father just days before he unknowingly became one. 3 weeks later, Second Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez reported for duty at Fort Bragg, home of the 82nd Airborne Division. As she walked through the gates wearing the same uniform her father had worn, she felt the circle of her life closing in the most perfect way possible. Her commanding officer, Major Lisa Santos, was a combat veteran who had heard the stories about Miguel Rodriguez's rescue mission during her own training. Rodriguez, she said during Sarah's in-processing, I want you to know that you've got big boots to fill, but also that you're not expected to fill them exactly the way your father did. The 82nd needs Maria Rodriguez, not a copy of Miguel Rodriguez. Sarah's first assignment was as a platoon leader for a group of young soldiers, most of them barely out of high school and facing their first deployment overseas. As she stood in front of them during her initial address, she saw herself as she had been just 8 months earlier, uncertain, untested, but carrying dreams bigger than their fears. My name is Lieutenant Rodriguez, she began, and I want to tell you about why I became a soldier. She told them about growing up in foster care, about joining the Army to find her place in the world, about discovering that her birthmark wasn't just a strange coincidence, but a symbol of inherited duty. She told them about her father, about the choice he made to risk everything for people he'd never met, and about the lesson that heroism wasn't about being fearless but about acting despite your fears. Each of you is here for your own reasons, she concluded, but while you're under my command, you're part of something bigger than any individual story. We're paratroopers. We're the people who jump out of perfectly good airplanes to help others when they need it most. And just like my father taught me through his example, we don't leave people behind. Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into her duties with the same determination that had carried her through OCS. She earned the respect of her soldiers not because of her father's legacy, but because of her own actions, her willingness to share the hardest tasks, her ability to remain calm under pressure, and her genuine care for the people under her command. During a training exercise that simulated a disaster relief operation, one of her soldiers, Private First Class Jackson, was injured in a simulated building collapse. While medical personnel worked to stabilize him, Sarah stayed by his side, holding his hand and talking him through the panic attack that followed his injury. "You're going to be okay," she told him, her voice steady and reassuring. "I've got you, and we're going to get through this together." Later, after Private Jackson had been treated and released, he approached Sarah privately. "Ma'am," he said, "my dad served in Afghanistan about 20 years ago. He always told me that the best officers were the ones who made you feel like you weren't alone, no matter what happened. Thank you for being that kind of officer." As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she stopped at the memorial wall where her father's name was engraved among other fallen soldiers from the 82nd Airborne. She touched his name gently, feeling the weight of the uniform on her shoulders and the pride that came with wearing it. "I made it, Dad," she whispered. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." A year later, when Sarah was promoted to first lieutenant and received orders for her first deployment overseas, she stood once again in front of her soldiers, some familiar faces, some new ones, all of them looking to her for leadership and guidance. "Tomorrow we deploy," she told them, "and some of you are scared. That's normal. That's human. But remember this, courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is feeling that fear and choosing to act anyway. Because the mission matters more than our comfort, and the people we're sworn to protect matter more than our personal safety." She paused, thinking about a young soldier who had made that same choice 24 years earlier, and about the legacy that had somehow found its way to her through blood and birthmarks and the mysterious ways that heroism travels through families. "We are the 82nd Airborne," she continued, "and we don't leave anyone behind." As her soldiers prepared for deployment, Sarah touched the birthmark on her shoulder one last time. No longer hidden, no longer a source of shame or confusion, but a symbol of everything she had inherited and everything she had chosen to become. Maria Elena Rodriguez had found her way home at last, and she was ready to write the next chapter of a story that would continue as long as there were people willing to risk everything to protect others. The uniform that had been taken away from her during that first medical examination at boot camp had been returned to her transformed, not just as clothing but as armor, carrying forward the dreams of a father she'd never known and the promise of a future where courage and compassion would always find a way to triumph over fear and indifference. She was her father's daughter, but she was also her own woman, ready to serve, ready to lead, and ready to make sure that the promise whispered to a newborn baby in the back of a military transport vehicle 24 years ago would continue to be kept for generations to come.